Sarah Chun adjusted her thick-rimmed glasses and squinted at the computer screen displaying satellite imagery of downtown Kandahar. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what her badge claimed she was, a senior intelligence analyst for the Department of Defense, someone whose biggest daily challenge was deciphering grainy photographs and writing reports that other people would use to make life-or-death decisions. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile briefing room at Bagram Airfield. Around her, a dozen other analysts hunched over their workstations, fingers clicking across keyboards as they processed the endless stream of intelligence data flowing in from across Afghanistan. The air conditioning struggled against the desert heat outside, creating a constant background whisper that had become as familiar as breathing. "Chun, you got anything new on the Haqqani network movements in Sector 7? Called out Major Williams from across the room. His voice carried the tired edge of someone who had been deployed too long and seen too much. Sarah's fingers paused over her keyboard for just a moment before she responded. "Still processing the overnight surveillance, sir. Should have something for you within the hour." It was a perfect lie, delivered with the bland professionalism that had made her invisible for the past 3 years. The truth was far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. Sarah knew exactly where key members of the Haqqani network were moving because she had been tracking them through the crosshairs of a Barrett M82 sniper rifle for the past 6 months. Her analysis came not from satellite images, but from personal observation through high-powered scopes, often while lying motionless on rooftops for 12 hours at a stretch. The deception had started as operational necessity and evolved into something approaching art. During the day, she was Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, intelligence analyst with a master's degree in Middle Eastern studies and a reputation for thorough, accurate reporting. Her superiors praised her ability to predict enemy movements with uncanny accuracy. Her peers respected her quiet competence and willingness to pull long hours when operations demanded it. None of them knew that their reliable analyst was actually Sierra 7, one of only 12 female snipers in Joint Special Operations Command, and the holder of more confirmed kills than any other operator in theater. Her official record showed deployment to a desk job at Bagram. Her real record was locked away in files so classified that even the people reading her reports had no idea who was really providing the intelligence. Sarah minimized the satellite imagery window and pulled up what appeared to be a routine intelligence summary. In reality, she was reviewing notes from her last mission, 3 nights earlier, when she had eliminated a bomb maker whose workshops had been responsible for at least 15 coalition casualties. The target had been moving through a crowded marketplace, believing himself safe among civilians. He had been wrong. Her phone buzzed with a text message that appeared to be about lunch plans. Sarah read the coded message twice before deleting it. New tasking. Extraction point Charlie. 2,300 hours. High-value target. She glanced around the briefing room, taking in the familiar scene of analysts at work. In 6 hours, while her colleagues were sleeping in their air-conditioned bunks, she would be somewhere very different. The transformation from desk-bound analyst to lethal operative required more than just changing clothes. It required becoming someone else entirely. "Chun, got a minute?" Major Williams appeared beside her workstation, holding a thick folder marked with classification warnings. "Of course, sir." Sarah minimized her screen and turned to face him, adjusting her glasses in a gesture that had become automatic. The thick lenses were plain glass, part of her carefully constructed cover identity. Her vision was actually better than 20/20, a genetic gift that had helped make her one of the most accurate shooters in the military. "Need your take on these intercepts from the Paktia province." Williams dropped the folder on her desk. "Something's got the bad guys spooked over there. Lots of chatter about a ghost, someone picking off their leadership. Intel thinks it might be a new sniper team operating in the area." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. "I'll take a look, sir. Any specific concerns from command?" "They want to know if we can identify the shooter. Apparently, whoever it is has some very specific skills. Long-range shots, impossible angles, targets that should have been untouchable. Either we've got someone new in theater, or one of our people is better than we thought." The irony was almost overwhelming. Williams was asking her to analyze her own work, to provide intelligence about herself, to help command understand what was happening in Paktia province. She had been operating there for 2 months, working through a target list that had taken her from mountain caves to urban safe houses. I'll cross-reference with known coalition operations in the area, she said, opening the folder and scanning the first few pages. The intercepts were fascinating, enemy communications showing a level of fear and confusion she had hoped to achieve. They were calling her the ghost and the shadow that kills. Some reports described an American sniper with supernatural abilities. Others suggested she might be a local fighter trained by special forces. None of them suspected that their hunter was a 28-year-old woman from California who spent her days analyzing their communications from an air-conditioned office. "Take your time with it," Williams said. "Command wants a full assessment, but they're not in a rush. Whoever this shooter is, they're on our side, so it's not exactly a priority threat." After Williams left, Sarah dove into the intercepts with genuine professional interest. Reading enemy communications about her own operations was like looking at herself through a funhouse mirror. The reports were wildly inaccurate in details, but surprisingly insightful about her methods. The insurgents had figured out that their leadership was being systematically targeted, and they were adapting their security procedures accordingly. That was good intelligence, even if they didn't know where it was coming from. Her computer chimed with an incoming secure message. Sarah opened it to find what appeared to be a routine intelligence update about enemy vehicle movements. Embedded in the message was her real briefing for the night's operation. The target was Ahmad Rashid, a mid-level commander who had been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. He would be attending a meeting in a compound outside Kabul, arriving sometime after midnight. Sarah began drafting her analysis of the satellite imagery, building the intelligence picture that would justify why she knew exactly where Rashid would be. She had learned to work backward from her missions, creating plausible analytical chains that explained her uncanny accuracy. It was like writing fiction, except the consequences of plot holes could get people killed. The afternoon passed in a blur of legitimate work mixed with mission preparation. Sarah reviewed actual intelligence reports, updated her analysis of enemy communication patterns, and participated in a briefing about supply route security. All routine analyst duties that provided perfect cover for her real preparation. Studying building layouts, calculating wind patterns, and memorizing extraction routes. At 1800 hours, Sarah logged off her computer and headed to the dining facility with the rest of her shift. She made small talk about the food quality and complained about the workload, just another analyst unwinding after a long day. Nobody noticed that she barely touched her dinner or that she kept checking her watch. By 2000 hours, she was back in her quarters, supposedly preparing for an early bedtime. Her roommate, a logistics officer named Jennifer, was already asleep, exhausted from managing supply convoys that Sarah's nighttime work helped protect. Sarah moved quietly through her evening routine, but instead of putting on pajamas, she reached for the carefully hidden equipment bag at the bottom of her footlocker. The transformation from analyst to sniper was methodical and complete. Off came the conservative blouse and practical slacks, the thick glasses, and carefully styled hair. On went the tactical gear that had become like a second skin. Ghillie suit components, night vision equipment, communications gear, and the custom rifle that she had never officially been issued. Sarah Chun, intelligence analyst, disappeared. In her place stood Sierra 7, one of the most lethal operators in the theater of operations. At 2,230 hours, she slipped out of the quarters building through a maintenance exit she had memorized months earlier. The base was busy with nighttime operations, but Sarah knew exactly how to move to avoid security cameras and casual observation. Within 10 minutes, she had reached the extraction point where a nondescript vehicle waited with its engine running. "Evening, Ghost," said the driver, a special operations sergeant named Martinez who knew her only by her operational call sign. He had been her regular support for 6 months, but had never seen her face in daylight or known her cover identity. "Evening," Sarah replied, settling into the passenger's seat and pulling on her night vision goggles. "Targets confirmed. Rashid's convoy arrived 20 minutes ago. 3 vehicles, standard security detail. Intel says the meeting should run until at least 0200. Sarah nodded and began her final equipment check. Her rifle was a modified M24, customized for urban operations with a suppressor and enhanced optics. Every component had been tested and retested until the weapon had become an extension of her will. At distances up to 800 meters, she could place a bullet within a 2-inch circle in any weather conditions. The compound where Rashid was meeting was a 3-story building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Sarah had scouted it twice during previous operations, identifying 17 different firing positions and 12 different escape routes. Tonight, she would use position Alpha 7, a rooftop 400 meters northeast of the target building. The drive took 40 minutes, winding through back streets and avoiding checkpoints. Martinez was good at his job, and Sarah used the time to review the mission parameters one final time. Single target elimination, minimal collateral damage. Extract immediately after shot confirmation. Ghost, we're 2 minutes out, Martinez said as they approached the final waypoint. Sarah pulled her ghillie hood up and checked her communications equipment one last time. In a few hours, she would be back at Bagram, sleeping in her bunk like any other analyst after a routine shift. But first, she had work to do. The vehicle stopped in an alley 3 blocks from her target building. Sarah slipped out without a word, melting into the shadows like she had never been there at all. Martinez would wait exactly 45 minutes before heading to the secondary pickup point. If she didn't show, he would assume the mission had gone wrong and follow predetermined protocols. Sarah moved through the empty streets like a ghost, using doorways and shadows to avoid the occasional patrol or late-night resident. Her route to the firing position took her through a maze of alleys and over 2 rooftops, but she had practiced it enough times that she could navigate by feel. The building she had chosen was abandoned, its residents long since fled to safer neighborhoods. Sarah entered through a rear window she had left unlocked weeks earlier and climbed 3 flights of stairs to the roof access. Every step was calculated to avoid noise, every movement practiced until it had become automatic. On the rooftop, she assembled her firing position with the efficiency of long experience. The ghillie netting broke up her outline against the building's edge. The rifle bipod provided a stable shooting platform. The night vision scope gave her a clear view of the target compound's entrance and windows. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the familiar ritual of becoming one with her weapon. Breathing slowed. Heart rate dropped. The world narrowed to the view through her scope and the careful calculation of wind, distance, and timing. Through her earpiece, she heard the voice of Overwatch confirming target identification. Rashid had arrived and was inside the compound. Security was light, overconfident in the safety of their neighborhood meeting. They were about to learn otherwise. At 0147 hours, Ahmad Rashid appeared in a lit window on the 2nd floor of the compound. Sarah's crosshairs found him immediately, tracking his movement as he gestured to other figures in the room. The shot was clean, the angle perfect. Sarah controlled her breathing and squeezed the trigger with the same methodical precision she brought to her analytical work. The suppressed rifle coughed quietly, and 400 meters away, Ahmad Rashid dropped from view. Target down, she whispered into her radio, already beginning to pack her equipment. By 0200 hours, she was back at the extraction point. By 0230, she was slipping back into her quarters at Bagram. By 0245, she was in her bunk, uniform hung neatly in her locker, thick glasses on the nightstand beside her bed. At 0600 hours, her alarm would sound, and Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, intelligence analyst, would begin another day of routine work. She would analyze satellite imagery, brief officers on enemy movements, and provide the same professional competence that had made her invisible for 3 years. And none of her colleagues would ever suspect that their quiet analyst had just eliminated one of the most wanted insurgent commanders in theater, using skills they didn't know she possessed and equipment that officially didn't exist. The deception was perfect, seamless, and absolutely necessary. In a war zone where information was power and secrecy meant survival, Sarah Chun had found the ultimate camouflage, hiding in plain sight as someone completely different from who she really was. But even perfect deceptions couldn't last forever. And in the complex world of counterinsurgency operations, today's successful mission could become tomorrow's catastrophic exposure. Sarah fell asleep thinking about her next analyst assignment. a review of communication intercepts that would help her plan her next operation. The irony had long since stopped bothering her. Instead, it had become her greatest weapon. 3 months after the Rashid operation, Sarah's double life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Her success rate as an analyst had earned her a reputation throughout the intelligence community, while her effectiveness as Sierra 7 had enemy networks in chaos. The two identities fed each other in ways that made her invaluable in both roles. The morning briefing at Bagram started like any other. Sarah sat in the third row of the operations center, surrounded by analysts, case officers, and operational planners reviewing the night's intelligence take. Major Williams stood at the front of the room, clicking through slides that painted a picture of an enemy network under pressure. As you can see from these intercepts, Williams said, pointing to a map dotted with red indicators, the Haqqani network has lost 17 key personnel in the past 6 months. Their communication patterns show significant disruption, and we're seeing evidence of internal discord over security procedures. Sarah took notes in her analyst notebook while mentally reviewing each of those 17 eliminations. She had been responsible for 11 of them personally, with the others handled by conventional special operations teams using intelligence she had provided. The network was fracturing exactly as planned, but she couldn't show any satisfaction in her analyst role. "Chun," Williams called out, making her look up from her notes. "You've been tracking their leadership structure. What's your assessment of their ability to regenerate these losses?" Sarah adjusted her glasses and consulted her notebook, though she knew the answer from personal observation. Based on communication analysis and movement patterns, they're pulling second-tier leadership up from Pakistan. But these new leaders lack the operational experience and local knowledge of their predecessors. We should see a continued degradation in their ability to coordinate complex operations. It was a perfect analyst assessment, backed by classified sources and methods that her colleagues couldn't verify. What they didn't know was that her evaluation was based on watching these replacement leaders through a rifle scope, noting their obvious nervousness and amateur tradecraft. "Excellent work," Williams said. "I want you to brief the task force commanders this afternoon. They need to understand how effective our operations have been." After the briefing, Sarah returned to her workstation and pulled up the latest batch of communication intercepts. Reading enemy radio traffic had become one of her favorite parts of the analyst job, especially when the conversations were about her own operations. Today's intercepts were particularly interesting. The messages showed increasing paranoia within insurgent networks about what they called the systematic hunter. They had figured out that their losses weren't random, that someone was working through their leadership with methodical precision. Some reports described an American sniper with supernatural abilities. Others suggested a team of operators with advanced intelligence capabilities. One intercept from a Haqqani subcommander particularly caught her attention. "The Shadow knows our movements before we make them. No safe house remains safe. No meeting goes unobserved. Our brothers speak of a ghost that kills with the precision of Allah's own judgment." Sarah smiled slightly as she typed her analysis. The fear in their communications was exactly what psychological operations aim to achieve. When the enemy started believing their opponents possessed supernatural powers, they made mistakes born of desperation and superstition. Her secure phone buzzed with what appeared to be a routine message about supply chain logistics. Sarah decoded it quickly. Priority target opportunity. Time-sensitive operation. Briefing at 1,400 hours. Location Bravo 7. She glanced around the analysis center, noting which of her colleagues were deep in their own work. Sarah had learned to read the room instinctively, always aware of who might be watching when she received operational communications. After 3 years of maintaining her cover, the paranoia had become second nature. At 1,345 hours, Sarah informed her supervisor that she was taking a break to review classified materials in the secure reading room. It was a perfect excuse that explained her absence without raising questions. The secure reading room was soundproofed and monitored only by people who were part of her operational security. The briefing was delivered by Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, one of only 6 people at Bagram who knew Sarah's true assignment. He was a career special operations officer who understood the value of her dual role and had helped design the cover identity that kept her invisible. "Ghost, we've got a problem," Harrison said without preamble. High-value target, but the window is narrow and the complications are significant. Sarah reviewed the intelligence package he handed her. The target was Mahmoud Al-Qasr, a senior facilitator who moved money and weapons between networks. Intelligence indicated he would be attending a funeral in a village outside Jalalabad, but only for a few hours before disappearing back into Pakistan. What's the complication? Sarah asked, though she was already seeing the issues in the operational overview. The funeral is for a village elder, not a combatant. There will be women, children, and civilians throughout the area. Traditional rules of engagement apply, but the target hasn't presented a clean opportunity in 18 months. This might be our only chance. Sarah studied the satellite imagery and intelligence reports. Al-Qasr was responsible for financing operations that had killed dozens of coalition personnel, but eliminating him at a civilian funeral would require extraordinary precision and careful timing. I'll need Overwatch confirmation of target identification, she said, and detailed intelligence on the funeral schedule. When does he arrive? How long does he stay? Where does he position himself? That's the other complication, Harrison replied. We don't have assets in the village. You'll be operating without real-time intelligence support. Everything depends on your ability to identify the target and wait for a clean shot. It was exactly the kind of mission that separated elite operators from conventional snipers. Sarah would be working alone in an environment full of innocent people. With a target, she might only have seconds to engage. The margin for error was essentially zero. Timeline, she asked. Target arrives tomorrow at 1,100 hours. Funeral services run until approximately 1400. You'll need to be in position before dawn. Sarah nodded and began planning her approach. The village was in a valley surrounded by hills that offered several possible firing positions. She would need to choose one that provided clear sight lines while remaining far enough from civilian areas to avoid detection. What's my cover story for absence? Emergency analysis request from Kabul. You're being temporarily assigned to review time-sensitive intelligence that requires your specific expertise. Your supervisor has already been briefed. The cover story was perfect, explaining her absence while reinforcing her reputation as a valuable analyst. Sarah had learned that the best deceptions were built on elements of truth, and her analytical skills really were in high demand. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her workstation and spent the afternoon on legitimate analytical work while mentally planning her approach to the Al-Qasr operation. She reviewed weather forecasts, calculated distances and angles, and memorized satellite imagery of the target area. At 1800 hours, she participated in the routine evening briefing, discussing enemy activity patterns and providing intelligence updates to operational commanders. Her colleagues saw her as particularly focused that day, attributing her intensity to the important analysis project she was supposedly working on. Nobody noticed that her focus was actually on memorizing terrain features and calculating bullet trajectories for a mission that would happen before any of them woke up. That evening, Sarah went through her normal routine of dinner and casual conversation with other off-duty personnel. She complained about the workload and made plans to catch up on sleep over the weekend. Every interaction was designed to reinforce the impression that she was just another analyst dealing with the usual deployment stresses. At 2,200 hours, she slipped away from the common areas and began her transformation. The process had become ritualistic, each step taking her further from her analyst identity and closer to her role as Sierra 7. Off came the glasses and conservative clothing. On went the tactical gear and equipment that turned her into one of the most lethal operators in theater. The infiltration to the target area required a 2-hour drive, followed by a 3-mile approach march through mountainous terrain. Sarah's support team dropped her at a waypoint 5 kilometers from the village, far enough away that vehicle noise wouldn't alert anyone to unusual activity. Moving through the mountains in darkness required all of her fieldcraft training. Sarah navigated by night vision and GPS, but relied on her instincts to avoid the small patrols and watch posts that protected approaches to the village. Every step had to be calculated to avoid loose rocks or vegetation that might create noise. By 0400 hours, she had reached her planned firing position on a ridgeline 800 meters from the village center. The location offered clear sight lines to the area where the funeral would take place, while remaining far enough from civilian areas to ensure operational security. Sarah established her position with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. Ghillie knitting broke up her outline against the rocky terrain. Range cards marked distances to key reference points. Communications equipment connected her to Overwatch support that would monitor the operation from satellite imagery. As dawn broke over the valley, Sarah watched the village come to life through her rifle scope. Women emerged to tend cooking fires. Children played in dirt streets between mud brick houses. Men gathered in small groups to discuss the day's activities and the funeral preparations. It was exactly the kind of complex civilian environment that made precision operations so challenging. Sarah would have to distinguish her target from dozens of other people, wait for a clear shot that wouldn't endanger innocent civilians, and execute the engagement without revealing her position to the inevitable security elements protecting Alcasser. Through her earpiece, she received updates from Overwatch as satellite imagery tracked incoming vehicles. 3 cars had departed the Pakistani border area at 0800 hours, moving toward the village on the route intelligence predicted Alcasser would use. At 1047 hours, the vehicles arrived. Sarah watched through her scope as men in traditional dress emerged from the cars and moved toward the gathering crowd. Most were obvious security personnel, scanning the area and positioning themselves around the funeral site. Then she saw him. Mahmoud Alcasser was instantly recognizable from the intelligence photographs, though he had grown a fuller beard and was dressed in the simple clothing of a village mourner. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, and the security personnel deferred to him in subtle ways that confirmed his identity. Sarah tracked him through her scope, calculating angles and timing as he moved through the crowd. The funeral was conducted in the traditional manner, with prayers and speeches honoring the deceased village elder. Alcasser participated respectfully, showing none of the arrogance that characterized him in intelligence reports. For 2 hours, Sarah waited for a clean shot. Alcasser was constantly surrounded by other mourners, including women and children who made any engagement impossible. He seemed aware of his vulnerability, staying close to groups of civilians and avoiding open areas where a sniper might have clear sight lines. At 1319 hours, the funeral prayers concluded. Sarah watched as the crowd began to disperse, with Alcasser moving toward his vehicles. This was her window, the few minutes when he would have to cross open ground to reach his transportation. She controlled her breathing and settled into her final firing position. Through her scope, she tracked Alcasser as he said goodbye to village leaders and began walking toward the waiting cars. His security detail moved with him, but there would be a moment when he would be exposed. At 1324 hours, Alcasser paused 20 meters from his vehicle to answer his mobile phone. For just a few seconds, he was isolated from the crowd, standing in a clear area with no civilians in the background. Sarah's crosshairs found him immediately. Distance, 847 meters. Wind, negligible. Target, stationary. She squeezed the trigger with the same methodical precision she brought to her analytical work. The suppressed rifle coughed quietly, and 800 meters away, Mahmoud Alcasser dropped to the ground. Target down, she whispered into her radio, already beginning to pack her equipment. The confusion in the village was immediate but controlled. Alcasser's security team moved efficiently to secure the area and evacuate their personnel, but they were searching for threats in the wrong direction. Sarah's position was far enough away that the sound of her shot had been lost in the mountain echoes. By 1400 hours, she was moving back toward her extraction point. By 1700 hours, she was at Bugram, changing back into her analyst uniform. By 1900 hours, she was in the dining facility, complaining about the difficulty of her emergency analysis assignment and looking forward to getting back to normal duties. The next morning, Sarah Chun attended the daily intelligence briefing where Major Williams announced that Mahmoud Alcasser had been killed in what appeared to be a targeted assassination near Jalalabad. Excellent work by whoever was responsible, Williams said. Alcasser was a key facilitator whose elimination will significantly disrupt financial networks supporting operations in this sector. Sarah took careful notes, and asked thoughtful questions about the implications of Alcaster's death for ongoing operations. Her analysis was thorough and insightful, demonstrating exactly the kind of expertise that made her so valuable to the intelligence community. None of her colleagues suspected that their reliable analyst had personally eliminated the target they were discussing, using skills they didn't know she possessed and methods that officially didn't exist. The deception was still perfect, but in the complex world of counterinsurgency operations, success often carried the seeds of eventual exposure. And Sarah's effectiveness in both her roles was about to create complications that even her careful planning couldn't anticipate. The first crack in Sarah's perfect deception came from an unexpected source: success. After 18 months of systematic operations, her effectiveness as Sierra 7 had become so notable that it was generating attention from people who asked dangerous questions. Colonel James Morrison from the Pentagon's Special Operations Command arrived at Bagram on a Tuesday morning in September, carrying credentials that opened every door and demanded answers to questions that made Sarah's handlers nervous. Morrison was a legend in special operations circles, a career officer whose job was identifying exceptional performance and understanding how to replicate it. Sarah first learned about Morrison's visit during the morning intelligence briefing, when Major Williams mentioned that a visiting colonel would be reviewing operational effectiveness metrics for the past year. It seemed like routine Pentagon oversight until Harrison pulled her aside after the meeting. "We have a problem," Harrison said, leading her to the secure conference room they use for operational briefings. "Morrison isn't here for a routine review. He's trying to figure out who's been eliminating high-value targets with such precision." Sarah felt her stomach drop, but kept her expression neutral. "How much does he know?" "He's identified a pattern in the eliminations. 23 confirmed kills over 18 months, all with characteristics that suggest a single operator or a very small team. He's cross-referencing operational deployments, equipment requests, and personnel records to identify possible candidates." The implications were immediately clear. If Morrison was thorough enough, he would eventually notice the correlation between Sarah's analytical predictions and the subsequent elimination of targets. Her cover identity had been built to withstand casual scrutiny, not the focused investigation of someone with Morrison's resources and experience. "What's his timeline?" Sarah asked. "Unknown. He's requested interviews with key intelligence personnel starting tomorrow. You're on his list because your analysis has been so accurate in predicting enemy movements." Sarah spent the rest of the day maintaining her normal routine while mentally planning contingencies. Morrison's investigation was exactly the kind of threat her operational security had been designed to prevent, but even the best deception could be unraveled by someone who knew what questions to ask. That evening, she received an encrypted message that appeared to be routine administrative correspondence. Hidden in the text was confirmation that Morrison had already identified several operators whose deployment records showed they could theoretically be responsible for some of the eliminations. Sarah wasn't on his initial suspect list, but she was definitely in his area of investigation. The next morning, Morrison began his interviews. Sarah watched him from across the operations center, noting the way he moved with the confident precision of someone who had spent decades in special operations. He was older than she had expected, probably in his early 50s, with gray hair and the kind of alert eyes that missed nothing. His first interviews were with obvious suspects, special operations personnel who had been deployed to the right areas at the right times. Sarah monitored the sessions indirectly, noting who was called in and how long they spent in the secure briefing room where Morrison was conducting his investigation. At 1,430 hours, Major Williams approached her workstation. "Chun, Colonel Morrison wants to speak with you about your analytical work. Conference room B, 1,500 hours." Sarah nodded professionally while her mind raced through possible approaches. Morrison would be expecting an analyst, someone who provided intelligence but didn't participate in operations. She needed to be exactly that person, with no trace of her operational experience showing through. At exactly 1,500 hours, Sarah knocked on the door of Conference Room B and entered to find Morrison reviewing a thick file at the central table. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck by how carefully he examined her, as if he was cataloging every detail for future reference. Staff Sergeant Chun, Morrison said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me. I understand you've been providing exceptional analytical support for operations in this theater. Thank you, sir. I try to provide accurate and timely intelligence to support our mission. Morrison opened the file in front of him, and Sarah caught a glimpse of documents that included her personnel record, performance evaluations, and examples of her analytical work. He had done his homework. Your analysis has been remarkably accurate in predicting enemy leadership movements, Morrison continued. Major Williams tells me you've correctly identified target locations with almost perfect precision. That's unusual in counterinsurgency operations. Sarah adjusted her glasses and maintained the slightly nervous demeanor she had perfected for interactions with senior officers. I've been fortunate to have access to excellent intelligence sources, sir. The communication intercepts and surveillance imagery have been particularly valuable. Walk me through your methodology, Morrison said. Take the Alcasser elimination, for example. How did you determine he would be at that specific village? It was exactly the kind of question Sarah had been dreading and preparing for. Morrison had identified one of her operations and was probing to understand how she had developed the intelligence that made it possible. Alcasser had family connections to the village, Sarah replied, pulling up details she had memorized from her cover file. Communication intercepts showed discussions about honoring a deceased elder, and pattern analysis of his previous movements suggested he would attend important family events despite security risks. Morrison made notes while she spoke, but his questions became increasingly specific. How had she identified the exact timing? What sources provided confirmation of his travel plans? Why had she been so confident in her assessment when other analysts were more cautious? Each question required Sarah to build on her carefully constructed analytical narrative while avoiding any hint of operational knowledge. She cited communication intercepts that existed, referenced surveillance imagery that had been collected, and described analytical techniques that were standard throughout the intelligence community. Your personnel record shows a master's degree in Middle Eastern Studies from Georgetown, Morrison said, shifting to a different line of questioning. What drew you to intelligence analysis? I've always been interested in understanding complex problems, sir. Intelligence analysis lets me use my academic background to support operations that make a real difference. Any interest in more operational roles? I notice you've turned down several opportunities for advanced training that might have led to field assignments. Sarah felt the first real spike of danger in the conversation. Morrison was probing whether she had avoided operational training, which would be consistent with a pure analyst, or whether she might have received such training through other channels. I found my current role very fulfilling, sir. I believe I can make the best contribution in an analytical capacity. Morrison spent another 20 minutes questioning her about her background, her training, and her methods. Sarah answered every question professionally, maintaining the persona of a dedicated analyst who was perhaps slightly overwhelmed by the attention from such a senior officer. When the interview concluded, Morrison thanked her for her time and dismissed her with the same professional courtesy he had shown throughout the session. But Sarah noticed that he made additional notes after she answered his final questions, and she left the room with the distinct impression that she had not been eliminated from his investigation. That evening, Sarah attended a routine social gathering in the recreation area, making normal conversation with her colleagues while mentally reviewing every aspect of her interview with Morrison. She had maintained her cover identity perfectly, but Morrison was clearly sophisticated enough to detect inconsistencies that might escape other investigators. Her secure phone buzzed with what appeared to be a routine weather update. Hidden in the message was intelligence that Morrison was expanding his investigation to include personnel who might be providing intelligence support for an unknown operator. He was apparently considering the possibility that someone was feeding information to a sniper team rather than conducting operations directly. The intelligence was both reassuring and concerning. Morrison hadn't identified her as a potential operator, but he was starting to examine the analytical side of the equation. If he focused on intelligence support, he might notice patterns that would lead him to her. 2 days later, Sarah's worst fears were confirmed. Morrison requested a second interview, this time specifically focused on her analytical methods and sources. Harrison warned her that Morrison was becoming suspicious of analytical accuracy that seemed too good to be random chance. "He's a smart investigator," Harrison said during their briefing. "He's figured out that someone with exceptional analytical capabilities would be necessary to support the kind of precision we've seen in recent operations." Sarah knew she was running out of time. Morrison's investigation was closing in on her from a direction her operational security hadn't fully anticipated. She had prepared for questions about her movements and activities, but not for someone who might unravel her cover by analyzing the quality of her intelligence work. The second interview was more intense than the first. Morrison had clearly spent time studying her analytical products in detail, and he had questions about specific pieces of intelligence that only someone with operational knowledge could have provided. "Your assessment of enemy safe house locations has been remarkably accurate," Morrison said, consulting a document that Sarah recognized as a summary of her analytical reports. "In several cases, you identified locations that weren't confirmed by other intelligence sources until after operations were conducted." Sarah maintained her composure while her mind raced through possible explanations. Morrison had identified the core weakness in her cover story. She was providing intelligence that was too good, too accurate, too detailed for someone who was supposedly working for satellite imagery and communication intercepts. "I've been fortunate to develop a good understanding of enemy patterns, sir," she replied. "Prolonged exposure to their communication methods and movement patterns has given me insights into their operational preferences." "Have you had any direct interaction with special operations personnel conducting these missions?" Morrison asked. It was a trap question designed to see whether she would admit to operational connections that weren't reflected in her official record. Sarah recognized the technique from her own interrogation training, the kind of question that could unravel a cover story if answered incorrectly. "Only through normal intelligence briefing channels, sir. I provide analytical products to operational commanders, but I don't have direct involvement in mission planning or execution." Morrison made more notes, but Sarah could see that her answers weren't satisfying his suspicions. He was clearly building toward some conclusion that she couldn't predict, and each question felt like it was drawing him closer to the truth. After an hour of increasingly pointed questions, Morrison dismissed her with the same professional courtesy as before. But this time, Sarah was certain that she had not eliminated his suspicions. If anything, her performance might have raised additional questions about inconsistencies between her analytical products and her claimed methodology. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling while her roommate slept peacefully beside her. For 3 years, she had maintained a perfect deception that allowed her to operate as one of the most effective snipers in theater while appearing to be nothing more than a dedicated analyst. Morrison's investigation threatened to unravel everything, not just her operational effectiveness, but the safety of everyone who had supported her cover identity. If her true role was exposed, it would compromise ongoing operations and put other operators at risk. For the first time since beginning her dual assignment, Sarah began to seriously consider the possibility that her perfect deception might be approaching its end. Morrison was too thorough, too experienced, and too determined to be satisfied with explanations that didn't fully account for the intelligence he was seeing. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and Sarah wasn't certain her carefully constructed cover identity would survive the attention of someone who specialized in finding the truth behind operational excellence. The game was changing, and she needed to be ready for whatever came next. The crisis that would shatter Sarah's carefully maintained double life began with what should have been a routine intelligence gathering mission in downtown Kandahar. 3 days after her second interview with Colonel Morrison, Sarah received tasking for an operation that would require her to venture into hostile territory during daylight hours, a significant departure from her usual nighttime precision strikes. The target was Hassan Nazir, a bomb maker whose workshops had been responsible for increasingly sophisticated explosive devices that were taking a heavy toll on coalition forces. Intelligence indicated that Nazir would be meeting with potential recruits at a tea house in Kandahar's Old Market District, an area so densely populated that conventional military operations were impossible. "This is different from your usual operations," Lieutenant Colonel Harrison explained during the mission briefing. "We need Nazir eliminated, but It has to look like internal conflict rather than coalition action. The political situation in the city is too delicate for an obvious American operation. Sarah reviewed the intelligence package with growing concern. The tea house was located in the heart of a busy marketplace, surrounded by civilian vendors and shoppers throughout the day. More problematically, the area was known to be heavily watched by insurgent security networks that would immediately identify any obvious coalition presence. "What's the cover story for my absence?" Sarah asked. "Emergency consultation in Kandahar. Your analytical expertise is needed for a time-sensitive intelligence review that can only be conducted at the regional command post. You'll be gone for 18 hours. The timeline was tight, but manageable. What concerned Sarah more was the operational environment. For 3 years, she had succeeded by operating in carefully controlled circumstances, usually at night, and always with extensive support infrastructure. This mission would require her to work in broad daylight, in a hostile urban environment, with minimal backup. "Extraction protocols?" she asked. "You'll be on your own until the primary extraction point at 1800 hours. If that's compromised, secondary extraction at 2100 hours. After that, emergency protocols, and you're responsible for getting to the embassy." It was exactly the kind of mission that separated elite operators from everyone else. Sarah would be working alone in enemy territory, with no immediate support if things went wrong. The margin for error was essentially zero. The next morning, Sarah went through her usual routine of morning briefings and analytical work while mentally preparing for the operation. She participated in discussions about enemy activity patterns and provided intelligence updates that would ironically help protect other coalition operations while she was conducting her own mission in the most dangerous part of the theater. At 1,200 hours, she informed Major Williams that she was departing for Kandahar to support the emergency intelligence review. Williams wished her luck and reminded her to stay safe in the city, advice that was more relevant than he realized. The infiltration into Kandahar required a complex series of vehicle changes and route alterations to avoid insurgent surveillance networks. Sarah's support team dropped her at a safe house in the city's outskirts, where she spent 2 hours transforming from analyst to operator. But this transformation was different from her previous operations. Instead of military gear and ghillie suits, Sarah adopted the appearance of a local woman, complete with traditional dress and documentation that identified her as a teacher returning from a conference in Kabul. The disguise was necessary to move through the marketplace without attracting attention, but it also stripped away most of her usual equipment and weapons. Her rifle for this mission was a compact .308 weapon broken down into components that fit inside a teacher's bag, alongside educational materials and personal items. The weapon could be assembled quickly, but it lacked the range and precision of her usual sniper system. For this operation, she would be working at distances of less than 200 meters, in an environment where escape would depend more on blending into the crowd than on stealth and camouflage. At 1,430 hours, Sarah entered the marketplace through the main entrance, moving with the practiced ease of someone who belonged in the bustling environment. The market was exactly as intelligence had described, a maze of narrow alleys lined with vendors selling everything from spices and textiles to electronic goods and household items. The noise and confusion provided perfect cover for surveillance, but also made it extremely difficult to identify potential threats. Sarah spent 45 minutes conducting reconnaissance, mapping the area around the tea house, and identifying the security elements that she could recognize among the crowd of shoppers and vendors. The insurgent watchers were obvious to someone with her training, but they were also numerous and well-positioned to observe anyone who didn't belong in the neighborhood. The tea house itself was a traditional establishment with an open courtyard where men gathered to drink tea, smoke hookah, and conduct business. From her position in a textile vendor stall across the narrow alley, Sarah had clear sight lines into the courtyard but would have only seconds to identify her target and execute the shot. At 1,547 hours, Hassan Nazir arrived with 2 companions. Sarah recognized him immediately from intelligence photographs, though he had grown a fuller beard and was dressed in the simple clothing of a local merchant. He moved with the nervous alertness of someone who understood the dangers of his profession, constantly scanning the crowd for threats he might have missed. Sarah began her final preparations, carefully assembling her rifle inside the large bag she carried while maintaining the appearance of someone examining textiles. The vendor, who was part of her support network, provided cover by engaging her in animated discussion about fabric quality and pricing. Through her concealed earpiece, Sarah received confirmation that Nazir had entered the tea house and was seated with his contacts in a section of the courtyard that provided her with a clear shot. The distance was 127 meters, well within her capabilities, but the complexity of the environment made this one of the most challenging shots she had ever attempted. Nazir spent 20 minutes in the tea house, discussing what appeared to be recruitment and training matters with his companions. Sarah waited patiently, controlling her breathing and timing her shot for the moment when civilian interference would be minimal. At 1,612 hours, Nazir stood to leave, moving toward an exit that would take him directly into Sarah's line of fire. She tracked him through her scope, waiting for the precise moment when he would be isolated from other people in the courtyard. The shot was perfect. Nazir dropped immediately, and the confusion that followed created exactly the kind of chaos that Sarah needed for her escape. In the initial moments after the shooting, witnesses weren't sure where the shot had come from, and the crowd's reaction provided perfect concealment for her withdrawal. Sarah disassembled her rifle quickly and melted back into the marketplace crowd, moving through predetermined escape routes that took her away from the tea house area. Within 10 minutes, she was 3 blocks away, appearing to be just another local woman shopping for household items, while security forces converged on the scene of the shooting. But as Sarah moved through the market toward her extraction point, she realized that something had gone wrong. The security response was too quick, too organized, and too focused for a normal reaction to unexpected violence. Instead of the confused scrambling she had expected, insurgent security teams were moving with the precision of people who had been prepared for exactly this kind of incident. More concerningly, several of the security elements seemed to be focusing their search on women, checking identification and asking questions that suggested they had some specific intelligence about the shooter's appearance or background. Sarah's disguise was excellent, but it wasn't designed to withstand focused scrutiny from people who knew what they were looking for. As she approached the first extraction point, Sarah received an emergency message through her concealed communications equipment. The extraction team had identified hostile surveillance around the pickup location and was aborting the primary plan. She would need to make her way to the secondary extraction point and wait until nightfall. Moving through the city for 6 additional hours required all of Sarah's fieldcraft training. She adopted the movement patterns and behavioral characteristics of a local woman, shopping at vendors, visiting a mosque for afternoon prayers, and maintaining the casual interactions that would keep her invisible in the urban environment. But the security situation was deteriorating rapidly. Insurgent teams were conducting systematic searches of the market area, checking identification and asking increasingly specific questions about strangers and recent arrivals. Sarah's false documentation was solid, but it wouldn't survive detailed investigation if someone became seriously suspicious. At 1847 hours, Sarah's worst fears were realized. As she moved through a narrow alley toward the secondary extraction point, she was approached by 3 insurgent security personnel who asked to see her identification and question her about her presence in the neighborhood. "Sister, we haven't seen you in a market before," one of them said in Pashto. "Are you visiting family in the area?" Sarah responded in fluent Pashto, explaining that she was a teacher returning from Kabul and staying with relatives while conducting business in the city. Her story was consistent with her documentation, and her language skills were perfect for someone with her supposed background. But one of the security men seemed suspicious of something in her manner or appearance. He examined her identification more carefully and asked additional questions about her family connections and her reasons for being in that specific part of the market. "Your accent is not from this region," he said. "Where did you say your family was from originally?" It was a test question designed to catch someone whose cover story had inconsistencies. Sarah answered correctly, drawing on her extensive cultural training to provide details about family history and regional connections that would be natural for her supposed identity. The interrogation continued for 10 increasingly tense minutes before the security team finally accepted her explanation and allowed her to continue. But as they walked away, Sarah heard one of them making a radio call that suggested they were reporting her presence to higher authorities. The security net was tightening, and Sarah realized that her extraction window was closing rapidly. Someone had provided insurgent networks with intelligence about the shooting that went far beyond normal security procedures. They were looking for a specific type of person, and her disguise might not withstand much more scrutiny. At 1923 hours, Sarah reached the secondary extraction point, a construction site on the outskirts of the market district. But as she approached the pickup location, she received an emergency abort signal. The extraction team had identified hostile surveillance around the site and determined that attempting pickup would compromise both Sarah and the support personnel. For the first time in 3 years of operations, Sarah was completely on her own in hostile territory. Her support network had been compromised, her extraction routes were under surveillance, and insurgent security teams were conducting increasingly focused searches throughout the area. As darkness fell over Kandahar, Sarah found shelter in an abandoned building and began planning her escape from the city. She had emergency protocols for exactly this situation, but they required her to operate without support for potentially several days while working her way to coalition-controlled territory. Through her communications equipment, she received a message that explained the severity of her situation. Intelligence intercepts indicated that insurgent networks had received advance warning about an American operative conducting the Nazir elimination. They knew approximately when the operation would occur, what type of operator would be involved, and had prepared countermeasures designed to trap whoever was responsible. Someone had betrayed her mission, and Sarah realized that her perfect deception might finally be unraveling. The hunt for Sierra 7 was no longer just an intelligence exercise conducted by Colonel Morrison from the safety of Bagram Airfield. The enemy knew she existed, they knew what she had done, and they were coming for her with everything they had. Sarah's 3-year success as the invisible sniper was about to face its ultimate test, and for the first time since beginning her dual assignment, she wasn't certain she would survive the next 48 hours. Sarah spent 36 hours evading capture in Kandahar before she discovered the truth that would change everything. The betrayal hadn't come from insurgent intelligence networks. It had come from within her own command structure, and the person hunting her was someone she had trusted completely. Hidden in a bombed-out school building on the second night of her escape, Sarah received an encrypted message that should have been impossible to send. The communication protocols she was monitoring were known only to her operational handlers, yet someone was using them to coordinate the search activities that had trapped her in the city. The message was brief but devastating. "Ghost, your analyst cover is blown. Morrison knows everything. Extraction impossible until situation resolved. Trust no one from Bagram command structure." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Colonel Morrison's investigation hadn't just identified her operational activities. It had somehow compromised her entire support network. Worse, someone with access to her communication protocols was actively working against her escape efforts. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing everything she knew about Morrison's investigation, trying to understand how her carefully constructed deception had been unraveled. The answer came from an unexpected source: her own analytical training. Morrison hadn't identified her through operational security failures or inconsistencies in her cover story. He had used advanced data analytics to correlate her intelligence reports with operational outcomes, building a mathematical model that proved someone with access to classified analytical products was providing targeting intelligence for precision elimination operations. The correlation was perfect, undeniable, and completely damning. Every one of her successful analytical predictions had been followed by an enemy elimination that matched her intelligence assessments. No legitimate analyst could have achieved that level of accuracy without operational access. But Morrison had made one crucial mistake in his investigation. In his determination to identify the mysterious sniper, he had shared his findings with someone who wasn't authorized to know about Sarah's dual assignment. That security breach had led directly to the compromise of her current operation. Through her emergency communication channels, Sarah learned that Morrison had briefed his suspicions to a joint task force that included Pakistani intelligence liaison officers. One of those officers had family connections to the insurgent network Sarah had been systematically dismantling, and he had provided enough information to set the trap that had nearly caught her in Kandahar. The betrayal was both personal and professional. Sarah had spent 3 years building relationships based on trust and shared mission commitment, only to discover that the system designed to protect her had been penetrated by someone working for the enemy. As dawn broke over her 3rd day in hiding, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. Instead of continuing to evade capture while waiting for extraction support that might never come, she would take the initiative and hunt down the people who had betrayed her. The first target was obvious: the Pakistani liaison officer who had passed information to insurgent networks. Sarah had his photograph, his daily schedule, and intimate knowledge of his security procedures from her analytical work. More importantly, she knew he would be attending a coordination meeting at the provincial government center that afternoon. Moving through Kandahar in daylight required all of Sarah's urban camouflage skills. She had abandoned her teacher disguise in favor of the more anonymous appearance of a young widow, complete with traditional mourning clothes that provided excellent concealment for weapons and equipment. The provincial government center was a fortified compound that normally would have been impossible for her to penetrate. But Sarah's analytical work had provided her with detailed knowledge of the facility's security procedures, shift changes, and blind spots that guards didn't know they had. At 1,347 hours, Sarah eliminated the Pakistani officer with a single shot as he left the coordination meeting. The suppressed rifle coughed quietly from her position in an abandoned building across the street, and her target dropped before his security detail even realized what had happened. But instead of immediately extracting from the area, Sarah waited. Her communications intercepts had indicated that the officer was scheduled to meet with local insurgent contacts after the government meeting, and she wanted to eliminate the entire network that had compromised her operation. The patience paid off. 2 hours after the first elimination, Sarah identified 3 insurgent security personnel who arrived at the government center, expecting to meet with the Pakistani officer. Their confusion and urgent radio conversations confirmed that they were part of the network that had been hunting her. Sarah spent the next 4 hours systematically hunting the people who had been hunting her. Using her intimate knowledge of insurgent communication patterns and movement procedures, she tracked them through the city and eliminated them one by one with the precision that had made her legendary among enemy networks. Each elimination sent shock waves through the insurgent security structure, creating exactly the kind of fear and confusion that Sarah had weaponized throughout her 3-year assignment. The hunters became the hunted, and the network that had nearly captured her began to collapse under the pressure of her counterattack. By nightfall, Sarah had eliminated 7 people directly involved in the operation against her, including the Pakistani officer and his primary insurgent contacts. The message was clear: betraying Sierra 7 carried consequences that extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations. At 2,134 hours, Sarah's communication equipment finally received the extraction signal she had been waiting for. A coalition special operations team had secured a helicopter landing zone outside the city, and she had a narrow window to reach the pickup point before insurgent reinforcements could respond to the day's eliminations. The movement to the extraction point took Sarah through neighborhoods where she had operated for 3 years, past safe houses and surveillance positions that had become as familiar as her own quarters at Bagram. As she moved through the darkness, she realized she was seeing the operational environment for the last time. Her dual assignment was over. Morrison's investigation had made it impossible for her to continue operating as both analyst and sniper, regardless of how effectively she had dealt with the immediate security breach. The mathematical correlations he had identified would continue to exist, and other investigators would eventually reach the same conclusions. The extraction helicopter lifted off from Kandahar at 2,347 hours, carrying Sarah back to Bagram and the most difficult conversation of her military career. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison was waiting for her in the secure briefing room where they had planned so many successful operations. "Ghost, we have a problem," Harrison said, using her operational call sign for what they both knew would be the last time. Morrison's investigation has created political complications that go far beyond operational security. Sarah reviewed the intelligence summary Harrison provided, learning that her counterattack in Kandahar had eliminated a Pakistani intelligence officer whose death was creating diplomatic incidents between coalition partners. The Pakistani government was demanding a full investigation, and Morrison's mathematical analysis was being used as evidence that American special operations were conducting unauthorized eliminations. "What's the official story?" Sarah asked. "You were never Sierra 7. The sniper operations were conducted by a classified special operations team that has been recalled to the United States. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun is an intelligence analyst who provided targeting support based on her exceptional analytical capabilities. It was a perfect cover story that explained Morrison's correlations while protecting Sarah's true role. The fictional sniper team would take credit for her eliminations, while she returned to legitimate analytical duties with a commendation for her intelligence support. But the deception came with a price. Sarah would never again operate as a precision shooter, never again experience the satisfaction of eliminating threats through personal action rather than analytical products. Sierra 7 would disappear into classified files that might never be declassified. "There's one more thing," Harrison said. "Morrison wants to debrief you personally about your analytical methods. He's convinced you have insights that could revolutionize intelligence operations." The irony was almost overwhelming. Morrison wanted to learn from her analytical techniques so he could train other intelligence officers to achieve her level of accuracy. He had no idea that her success came from personal operational experience rather than analytical brilliance. 3 days later, Sarah sat across from Morrison in the same conference room where he had conducted his investigation. But this time, she wasn't defending her cover story. She was being praised for analytical work that had supported some of the most successful operations in theater. "Sergeant Chun, your analytical products have been exceptional," Morrison said. "I've never seen intelligence assessments with such consistent accuracy. The operational commanders I've spoken with consider your work to be the gold standard for tactical intelligence." Sarah accepted the praise with the same professional demeanor she had maintained throughout her dual assignment. Morrison would never know that he was commending her for analyzing her own operations, or that his investigation had come closer to the truth than anyone realized. "I've recommended you for immediate promotion and assignment to the Pentagon," Morrison continued. "We need analytical capabilities like yours at the strategic level, where they can influence operations across multiple theaters." The assignment would take her away from operational environments forever, but it would also provide the perfect capstone to her cover identity. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun, exceptional analyst, would become a Pentagon success story whose insights had revolutionized tactical intelligence. 6 months later, Sarah reported for duty at the Pentagon, carrying security clearances that granted her access to some of the most sensitive operational intelligence in the military. Her new assignment involved developing analytical methodologies that could replicate the success she had achieved in Afghanistan. Her colleagues knew her as the analyst who had provided legendary intelligence support for special operations, someone whose assessments had been so accurate that they had enabled precision operations throughout the theater. None of them suspected that their new teammate was actually one of the most lethal snipers in military history. The deception was complete, seamless, and permanent. Sierra 7 had disappeared into the classified archives, while Sarah Chun began a new career built on the foundation of her own operational excellence. But on quiet evenings in her Pentagon office, as Sarah reviewed intelligence reports from Afghanistan and other operational theaters, she sometimes found herself calculating distances and wind patterns, muscle memory from a time when she had been both the hunter and the analyst, both the weapon and the intelligence that guided it. The perfect deception had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Sarah Chun had hidden behind the name, the analyst, so effectively that even when her operational identity was discovered, the truth remained classified at levels that protected her forever. In the end, her greatest victory wasn't any single elimination or successful mission. It was the fact that she had spent 3 years operating as two completely different people, and when the deception finally ended, both identities had emerged with enhanced reputations that would define the rest of her career. The analyst, and the sniper had become the same person, and Sarah Chun had proven that sometimes the most effective camouflage wasn't a ghillie suit or urban disguise. Sometimes it was simply being so good at something that nobody could believe you were capable of anything else. Her war was over, but her legend would continue in classified files and whispered stories among special operations personnel who knew that somewhere in the Pentagon's analytical divisions worked someone whose insights came from experience they would never be allowed to discuss. Sierra 7 was gone, but the analyst would carry those secrets forever, hidden in plain sight among people who respected her intelligence without ever suspecting the deadly skills that had made that intelligence possible. The perfect deception had become the perfect career, and Sarah Chun had finally found the ultimate hiding place. Success so visible that it made her invisible.